All right, everybody, please have your seats. We will begin here shortly. Excuse me. We will begin now. Thank you so much. For this presentation, we do have another student speaker, Izzy Abrosheva, from the master's degree. So please welcome Izzy, who will introduce Carolyn Jefferson-Jenkins.
Good afternoon. Hope this is working. Lovely. So good afternoon again. It's great to be here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Carolyn Jefferson-Jenkins, who is an internationally respected educator, author, and speaker, and whose decades of work are grounded in civil rights, voting rights, women's rights, African American history, and racial equity. And her career in public and higher education spans more than 50 years. Since 1998, Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins has worked with the U.S. Department of State Speakers and Specialists Program, engaging with audiences in more than 20 countries on topics related to the democratic process and elections, women's empowerment and women's history, the legacy of enslavement and African American history, and the impact of policies and laws for people of color in nations around the world. She was the first woman of color to hold the position of president of the League of Women Voters of the United States, where she spearheaded the future plan focusing the League's work on campaign finance reform, healthcare reform, education reform, as well as empowering women of color to run for elected office. Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins is the author of One Man, One Vote, The History of the African American Vote in the United States, as well as The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters, honoring the contributions of women of color in the suffrage movement and its legacy organization, which received the 2020 Indies Bronze Award in Women's Studies. She has been recognized in notable Black American women, who's who among successful African Americans, and who's who in American education. And she is also the recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award in Civic Leadership from Cleveland State University, the Making a Difference Award from John Carroll University, and the National Coalition of Black Civic Achievement Civic Leadership Award. In 2020, she received the Trailblazer Award from the League of Women Voters of Ohio and the Freedom Summer 64 Award from Miami University, Ohio, for her lifetime of civil rights activism. So please join me in heartily welcoming Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming back this afternoon for this presentation. As we ended the first session, the questions you asked are a good transition into my presentation, so it will seem organic as we continue to talk about race and gender and what it is like to participate in a democracy through the lens of those of us who are still struggling to feel like we are a part of, thank you, that democracy. I want to first thank the Center for American Studies and my colleagues at the embassy for recognizing that there is a need to view our conversation through a different lens. So thank you very much for making sure that we do that. Professor Woolner talked about a polarized state and a crisis in democracy, and he talked about the parallel between the past and the present. And then Professor Dion talked about the consequential elections of the future. To carry on that theme, none of that happens without people. And so what I'm going to be talking with you about is people. We, the people, who are active and participate and make this democracy work. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Can you see me? Yes. Well, then I'm not invisible. Can you hear me? Then I have a voice. But there were times throughout the history of the United States when I had neither. I was not seen and I was not heard because of gender and race. Throughout my school career, I had to memorize the preamble and be able to recite it upon demand. So as my capacity to remember is diminishing, I always carry my trusty pocket constitution. But the phrases that stuck out to me is establish justice, promote the general welfare, ensure domestic tranquility. And they caused me to question their interpretation because it was not my reality. I had to question why the promise of these words did not include me at various times in the recounting of our nation's history. So just as I learned the preamble, I learned to continually ask the question, who are we, the people, that the founders talked about in 1787? And who are we, the people, now? When did I become a part of that we? From 3/5 of a person in the original Constitution to a first-class citizen? How do we get there if we believe that we're not there yet? Through protest and legislation, amendments to the Constitution, the we in the preamble has expanded. It expanded the definition of who should benefit from the promise. We are currently witnessing one of the greatest demographic shifts in the United States history. Through age and immigration, things are changing. The founders could not have imagined they couldn't have imagined this, just as they could not have imagined our current crisis. Yet they did imagine and craft a foundational document that we are still tethered to, and the process to change it that would withstand if we choose to use it. So I would submit to you that after 2 centuries, the US Constitution is showing its age. And once again, we, the people, are beginning to question the need for a makeover. What kind of renewal do we need? And we have to ask ourselves the question, what happens if we do nothing? So I want to talk with you this afternoon about some triumphs and some setbacks and the need to continue to engage with the dynamic documents that serve as the foundation of our constitutional republic and that manifests in our democratic process. So I always offer a disclaimer. My opinions are my own, based on my lived experiences, and I am unapologetically candid, based on my sense of activism and participation. I don't speak for all Black people. I don't speak for all women. I don't speak for all senior citizens. I speak only for myself. The comments that I make are designed to provoke thought. You may not agree with me, and I hope in some instances you don't. But what I want you to do is to think about what I am saying as it relates to the United States and what that looks like on the world stage. I know that you are keenly interested in the election, and I wanted, well, I don't have to because my 2 colleagues have already provided you with the context you need to make that decision. And I've been so encouraged by the groups that I've met with so far and what their belief is and their knowledge is of the US process. And in some instances, I think that you all know a little bit more about what's going on in the US than some of us who live there and take it for granted on a day-to-day basis. So let's get started. The way that I have captured this, and Professor Williams said the past and the present are connected, they are. The 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. And it said the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 138 years after Black men got the right to vote, we were able as a country to elect the first person of color to serve as president of the United States. The same activism precipitated the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And I say that cautiously, because women of color did not really get the right to vote until 45 years later with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because the right to vote is 50 different ways of voting. So states knew what the law was, they just didn't implement it. And so women of color had to continue that fight. As you look at this picture, however, you cannot underestimate the courage that it took for women to march in 1913 for the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. But what this picture doesn't show you is that Black women were relegated to the back of the parade. Because of segregation, they were not integrated into the mainstream of that parade. In stark contrast, here we have the 2017 Women's March. Look at the diversity that has occurred. Look at the intergenerational way in which women are engaging and becoming active and making sure that their voices are heard. There is strength in numbers, and through marching and protesting and using social media, women are now making their voices heard. On March 7th, 1965, 2,000 people set forth from Selma, Alabama, which is a southern state, to march to Montgomery, Alabama, to register to vote. And as you can see from this picture, it was not received peacefully, and people were they were brutally attacked as they were trying to march peacefully. The person that you see being attacked is our late Congressman John Lewis. 50 years later, in the center, you'll also see John Lewis. 50 years later, he was able to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and was able to celebrate some of the progress that had been made in voting rights. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court, 1981. There were 12 years that passed before the next woman was appointed, and that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. After Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed, there was another 16 years before a woman was appointed. Now we have 4 women on the Supreme Court. Activism and participation can bring about change. In the 234-year history of the Supreme Court, out of 115 justices, there have only been a total of 6 women. 1992 was called the Year of the Woman because there were 5 women in the Senate. Today, 23% of Congress is women. That may seem impressive, but 52% of women are voters. So where is the gap that needs to be closed here? You'll notice that then is blank. What do we have now? For the first time, a woman ran and was elected as Vice President of the United States. There have been 49 vice presidents, and many people think that Vice President Harris was the first person of color. She was not. Charles Curtis was the first person of color, and he was a member of the Kaw Nation, a Native American, who served as vice president briefly under Herbert Hoover. When you look at this photo, and for those of us who are students of gender-based issues, we know the sacrifices that women make the double standards that they endure, the microaggressions that they have to endure, just to have a seat at the table. And to have a seat at the table doesn't always mean you have a voice at the table. So having a voice at the table makes it even more, important. What we hope happens is that this is not the exception, but ultimately becomes the rule, that in our nation, it becomes acceptable and normal, a new normal for women to be in top leadership positions. The cycle of history repeats itself as we look at our history of our government. This is a photo in 1970 of Kent State University and students protesting against the war in Vietnam. And in Kent State University in Ohio, there were 4 students who were killed by the National Guard in that protest. Now, in 2020, Black Lives Matter protests on the square, you'll notice some similarities in how people are protesting and the response to those protests. Now we start getting to my lived experiences. Then, whites only and colored only chairs, whites only and colored only water fountains. And so this is not something that I read about in a book. This is something that I lived. And this is one of the reasons why it is important, not just for me, but for all of us who came of age during the civil rights movement, to make sure that we are vigilant so that we don't lose the progress that we have made. I always look at this as a metaphor for what's going on currently. Conversations about race and gender are, again, at the forefront of most conversations that are taking place. That was then, this is now. And this is a photo that I take as I go home. This is the highway that I drive going home, Highway 64 in Chatham County. Notice the 60-foot Confederate flag and the Black Lives Matter sign. So the juxtaposition of those two symbols represent how divided we are as a nation and how polarized we are as a nation. And it is not something that goes unnoticed. And so there are people who rally around the Confederate flag at times, and then there are people who rally around the Black Lives Matter sign. It's interesting that within the last 6 months, the county has removed the Black Lives Matter sign, but not the Confederate flag, because the Confederate flag is on private property. This is what reminds me on a daily basis that the civil rights fight is still important. And even though there has been an expansion of the we, everybody's still not included, not in the minds and hearts of everyone. This is me in my uniform of resistance when I was in college. So I show this because I was one of those protesters. I was protesting against the war in Vietnam. I protested for the right to vote at 18. If people are going to war and dying at 18, we should have the right to vote. And so my first vote was when I was in college. As a result of our lobbying, the 26th Amendment was passed that said 18-year-olds could vote, and I couldn't wait to vote. 50 years later, I received an award for my activism and my civil rights activities, and I was pleased to receive that award. I think I also received an honorary doctorate for that, and I shared with the president, had I known I could just keep doing the work and get a doctorate for free, I wouldn't have done all the work that I did to get the original one. But it's important to know that the fight continues. This is not just a moment in time. It takes time. It took 72 years for the 19th Amendment to pass. It took another 45 years for the Voting Rights Act to pass that would empower Black women to vote. It takes time to make things happen. So as you are activists and participants, know that it is not just a day or a week or one moment in time. It is a journey, and you have to commit to that. This is an artifact that is very important to me. And the reason that it is important to me is because it was my grandmother's poll tax receipt. And many people have never seen an actual poll tax receipt. A poll tax was one of the voter suppression efforts that took place in the South, and she lived in Arkansas. In order for her to vote, not only did she have to pay her property tax, she had to pay $1, which seems like it's not a lot now, but as a teacher, she only made $32 a month. So $1, it was a lot of money at the time, but she shouldn't have had to pay anything to vote. And after years of looking at this artifact, a couple of years ago, I had a revelation. If you can see the date on that, this is dated October 1965. The Voting Rights Act was passed in August of 1965. So why is she still paying poll tax? And she's still paying poll tax because her state chose not to implement the federal legislation. Change comes, and it comes over a course of time, and it comes because of activism and participation. So we talked about the 15th Amendment, we talked about the 19th Amendment. It was not until 1947 that the legal barriers to voting for Native Americans were removed. And keep in mind, they were already there when this nation was formed, but they were not able to vote. One of the current issues for voter suppression that is still hindering in some states Native Americans from voting is that they don't have an address because they live on reservations. So if you don't have an address, you can't get an ID. And if you can't get an ID, then you can't vote. I currently live in the state of North Carolina, and that was an issue for us. And one of the things that has happened, thanks to a very progressive governor, they have found ways to get IDs and use the post office box as a legitimate ID. And so now, even though it was 1947 when Native Americans barriers were removed, it was 2024 before in North Carolina they were fully removed. You'll see in 1952, Asian ancestry and citizenship was considered. The 23rd Amendment, which allowed Washington, D.C. citizens to vote for president. We talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We talked about the 26th Amendment, which gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. And I will tell you who I voted for, and I know that from your history books, you may know the name, but you are way too young to know. I voted for Hubert Humphrey. Minnesota. Minnesota, nice. In 1965, ballots began to be offered in different languages, and each state needs to look at, is there a pocket of a majority where an additional language is needed, and those ballots need to be printed in that language. 1993, the National Voter Registration Act, which actually I had a hand in as well. It's called Motor Voter because it allowed people to register to vote when they got their driver's licenses. And it's all about access. If voting is a right and a responsibility, we should not have to jump through a lot of hoops to vote. In 2002, the Help America Vote Act was passed again under my tenure as the League of Women Voters. We lobbied for that. And what that required is that there was funding at the federal level to make sure that each state could update and have the proper voting tools for their communities. In Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, many people, and I agree, gutted the Voting Rights Act because it eliminated the provision that states needed prior approval to make changes to their voting laws. And the only states that needed prior approval were those who blatantly discriminated previously. And Bronovich versus the Democratic National Committee dealt with voting in precincts and voting out of precincts. So what's at stake? As we look at activism and participation, and as we look at what Professor Dion provided in terms of what is going on with our presidential candidates, what's at stake is economy and jobs, the environment, social justice, racial justice, healthcare, gender equality, election integrity, crime and violence, civil rights, the U.S. Supreme Court. We are still dealing with the global pandemic. It has not disappeared. Combating misinformation, which is an entirely different conversation that could go on for hours. What's the U.S. position on the world stage, et cetera. There's one glaring issue that I did not include. Anybody know what it is? That's one. But that could fall under healthcare. This one's like totally missing from the list. Yes. No, that I would put that under position of the world stage. How about immigration? You don't see immigration anywhere there. And that was intentional because immigration undergirds all of those issues as far as I'm concerned. So you could look at every one of those and underlying it is immigration. Those are the things that we can pinpoint, but there are other issues like what is going on in the world in terms of Israel and Palestine, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on with reproductive rights. I mean, there are any number of issues you could add to your list. And in the United States, that is done often because we have 50 different ways of voting. We have 50 states, we have territories, we have regional issues, we have all kinds of issues that are identified by particular groups of people and special interest groups. So this list is not exhaustive, and this list is not the only list. You can each make up your own list. But what is consistent is the continuation of a healthy democracy. And the question before us often is our democracy ailing or is it healthy? And I often say that democracy in the United States, as we look at it, has three phases. It's emerging, established, and evolving, and that's a cycle. So where are we in the cycle? I would say right now we're evolving. Our constitutional flaws have been exposed, more so than they ever have been before. And as a result of that, we can decide what we want to do as a nation. How are we going to change? Are we going to fix those flaws? Or are we going to continue to move down a path where we just untether ourselves from our documents and our norms and move in a totally different direction? When I talk to groups about activism and civic participation, it is critical for us to realize that we are all activists. It's just a matter of where we fall on the pyramid. So who are the allies? And that's the biggest portion of activists. The allies are, first of all, people who vote. They are the people who have conversations with their friends and colleagues about what's going on in the democracy. They are the people who post on social media. They are the people who send out text blasts. They're the people who are constantly making sure that those people who want to run for office have the support that they need to run for office. They are the people who are educating others. They are the people who are making information available. So in essence, that's all of us. The second group is advocates. They're a little more visible. They're the people that show up. They're the people that attend commissioners' meetings. They're the people that are observers at legislative meetings. They're the people that send email messages or text messages to their representatives telling them what they do or don't like. They are the people who are voicing the concerns of those of us who as allies may or may not have that time. And then the smaller part is activists. Smaller in number, not smaller in importance. And the activists are the people who are out there marching and the people you see on TV and the people who have that visibility. At different points in your life, you will be in different categories. There was a time when I was an activist. Now I'm an ally. I'll wait for you at the end of the march and share my wisdom, but I'm not marching with you. I don't have the stamina. So there are different times when we move from place to place. So don't think that this is a stagnant pyramid. The other thing is sometimes we have a loud voice and sometimes we can have a quiet voice. And people need to make an impact where they can. So you may not want to be out front, but you know certain people that you can have a conversation with. Make sure they're looking at accurate information. Take it upon yourself to do that. And so those are the kinds of things I share with people when we talk about activism and civic participation. Some people are leaders and some people don't want to be leaders. We have a passion and a purpose. And one of the things that you need to do is find your passion and your purpose. For me, it's voting rights and civil rights. I am a social justice activist, an advocate, an ally, and I'm unapologetic about it. So from my remarks, if you remember nothing else, remember this, that in a democratic system, progress is fragile, and it's we, the people, who must be vigilant lest we lose any gains that we've made, like rights being overturned 50 years after we were protesting to make sure that we achieved them. We have the responsibility to and for each other that transcends gender and race and age, political affiliation and zip code. We can effectively engage to affect change when we use our voices and when we hold our officials accountable and when we participate in the process. And we can make a difference, and this is very important, if we choose to stay in the fight. One of my favorite quotes is from Barbara Jordan, who was a lawyer, an educator, a politician, and a civil rights activist. She was the first woman from the South elected to the U.S. Congress, first Black woman from the South elected to the U.S. Congress. And she had, her quote was, "What the people want is simple. They want an America as good as its promise. That as a nation, we live up to our historical promise of equality of opportunity, that we believe that the gap between the promise and reality can one day be closed if each of us remembers that we share a common destiny." So what is the question before us in this moment? What is our responsibility as we? How do we make sense of any of this? This is how engagement works. So what I learned in the 1960s and 70s was transformational for me. What many of you have learned in 2020 through the pandemic, and for people in the United States in 2024 through this election, is also transformational. This could be your transformational year. So I was born in a segregated society. I came of age in a segregated society. I lived as an adult in what we wanted to believe was an integrated society. And now again, I live in what is arguably one of the most polarized, segregated times in US history. Over the course of my lifetime, when we have made great progress, we have also witnessed setbacks. It is disappointing to me that here I am, decades after reliving the reminders of the segregation of my youth, that I have to underscore again that we have to remain vigilant. This conversation is bigger than just one day, one person, and one moment in time. I know that my vote is an instrument for change, and I vote because we, the people, does mean me. This is America's promise to me, and I intend to collect on it. Every generation raises up a group of people who turn a moment into a movement. And I always ask, who will be that person from this generation? So every time we reflect on the principles of racial equality and nonviolent social change, every time that we make a personal pledge and commitment to expose social and racial injustice, and go about the business of eradicating it, every time that we make an intentional decision to fight for the future, every time that we protect the freedom to vote, every time that we advocate for those who have a voice but don't have the microphone, every time that we understand the times and know that we must act to make them better, every time we sit in our discomfort and bring about change, every time that we celebrate the unimaginable achievements as we did on January 20th, 2021, when the inauguration of Kamala Harris as Vice President of the United States happened, and again on October 3rd, 2022, with the appointment of Ketanji Brown Jackson as the first Black woman to serve as an Associate Justice in the United States Supreme Court. Every time that we make change for ourselves and our communities and our nation that is transformational and not transactional, we show up. Every time that we vote, as we will in upcoming elections, every time that we protest or advocate for what Barbara Jordan called an America as good as its promise, a democracy for all, every time that we expose social and racial injustice again and make it our business to eradicate it, we stand up. Every time that we make courage more contagious than fear, every time that we continue to write our own narrative, every time that we use our incredible power to bring calm to the chaos, we speak up. So we show up, we stand up, we speak up. Abraham Lincoln said that the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. So go with me on a journey of the future imagined. Imagine a United States where citizens have access to government and how to participate effectively in that government and make wise decisions for their community and their country. Imagine that new voters and young people who know what is expected of them as citizens show up and vote. Imagine a nation where all citizens have the opportunity to practice the skills of democracy for their families, neighbors, and national community for the common good. Imagine equality and access for all. Imagine, and you can complete the rest of that sentence. But imagine a nation where we had Abraham Lincoln's faith in democracy, Barbara Jordan's ideal of the promise of America, Fannie Lou Hamer's question, is this America? Shirley Chisholm's belief that we can make a difference, and my grandmother's faith in the power of action to secure her first-class citizenship. We will always have to worry about the fragility of democracy. Our foundational documents were designed to require that. Today, it's easy to forget the sacrifices that others have made, but we have permission and power to transcend the traditional and make it transformational. The difference between the constitutional promise and reality is civic engagement, activism, and participation. And at critical times in our history, generations of Americans have worked to do just that. The United States of America is not just the country I live in, it is the country that I believe in, despite the fact that I was sometimes invisible and sometimes unheard. I would say, as I talk about activism, working through change is exhausting, but the price of doing nothing is too high. Can you still see me? I am not invisible. Can you still hear me? I do have a voice. I am we, the people. Thank you.
1 second, we'll be right there. All right, here we go. So thank you so much, Professor Jefferson-Jenkins. We have maybe a couple of questions from the audience that we could just get to. We have one over here.
There's a student.
Hi, hello. My
Hi.
name's Camilla. Thank you very much for an incredible talk. My question, well, I was thinking, I think about a week ago, I listened to an interview with Melissa Murray, I think is her name, who made a program called Black Women in America, The Road to 2024. And her and another person went around the country and sort of interviewed a lot of women of color. And unfortunately, part of the takeaway from a lot of those encounters was this feeling of this feeling between these women of not being, of their voice not mattering, of not being heard. And I mean, I guess, given the history of the country that you've just outlined, and also the way that politics in America works today, I can sort of understand it, but it's also just, yeah, really sad. So I don't know. I think what I wanted to ask was, what do you think can be done to sort of change this sentiment, or this feeling?
Okay. Thank you for that question. This is an exciting time for women, not only feeling empowered, but also there are so many efforts afoot to mobilize groups of women. There's the issue of reproductive rights that is there. There is the issue of a woman running for president. There is the issue of the economy and jobs and how that impacts women and families. And so what I am seeing is a lot of activism in a lot of different areas and a lot of outreach. Social media has allowed for that to be like exacerbated. And I'm just amazed, because I often think when I first started registering people to vote, I had pencil and paper, and then I had to take it down to the County Board of Elections. Now it's all electronic. So where it took me a year to register 50,000 voters, you can do that in 5 minutes. And so I am seeing groups of women gathering via electronic means. And actually, I am a part of 2 of those groups. And every Sunday there's like a brunch, and it's via Zoom or whatever, Microsoft Teams, one of those 2. And so it's like hundreds of women listening to experts and pledging to be active. One of the great things about all of this mobilization is each of the groups has committed to have women take at least one other person to vote. So if we're 52% of the voting population, we are the majority. We just need to recognize that power and use it. That is not to say, and I always caution people, women are not a monolith in their voting practices. Black people are not a monolith in their voting practices. So I, as a nonpartisan person and as former league president, I don't care who you vote for, just vote. And then we'll go from there. So I rarely talk about candidates. I always talk about process and issues. And so what I say to women is, use your power to vote. We don't need to agree, but I just want you to vote. And at the end of the day, we get what the majority says we get. The path to 270, we get what the Electoral College says we get. But I need to also, and I did not talk about this, is all the down ballot issues. So there are more women running for office. And for instance, in North Carolina, I remind people, we're not just voting on president. There are 50 other issues on that ballot that we need to pay attention to. Governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, commissioners, attorney, all of those things that the people in the General Assembly who make decisions every day. What I see happening is more women wanting to run for office, which will be a good thing because that voice will be heard. Unfortunately, we still have double standards. We still, for women, many women, limited access to funding because they are not in the spaces where the conversation about big money is being had. And so we are still, as women, balancing, what or trying to define what our role is. But I am encouraged by the number of groups that have formed, by the number of women who are having conversations, podcasts, YouTube channels, the number of women who are on, I don't call them news stations, 24-hour commentary places that are making comments about things. So I understand that there's some caution and concern. That only motivates people. And so we need to just continue to motivate women to get out there and vote and to make sure that their voices are heard. When I go home, I'm an election worker, a poll worker. So I had my training just before I came here to Denmark. And the majority of people in the training were females. And so that means the conversations are being had about the importance of this election. So I was encouraged by that as well.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anita. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have a question about one point on your slides on election integrity.
I'm sorry, election integrity?
Integrity, right. And the threats or what threatens that integrity. I listened to an interview the other day where it was said that the threat actually happens on a very small dimension in the sense of on the county level. On the dimension of the referees and the people who are there to control that the election is correct and undergoing a correct way, because many threats go against those people who then kind of drop out and are replaced by more questionable officials in that sense. And then the interview, or the person who was interviewed, Rachel Kleinfeld, was from Carnegie, said there are no threats against voters. She was very, very adamant about this, right? And I was just curious to find out what your thought on that is.
And Professor Dion was shaking his head, so I'm sure he has a response as well. And you're right. So this is a complex time and you heard me say I'm a poll worker. This is a complex time for that whole environment. We don't really know how people act when they're frustrated or if something changes. For instance, in North Carolina, this will be the first election where people are required to show an ID to vote. So that is going to be frustrating to some people. We have learned, this is the first year in our training that we had active shooter training and de-escalation training. So all the years that I've been a poll worker, I've never had that. And as a result of that, to your point, after the training, there were about a third of the people who said they wouldn't do it. They were not going to do it. And you can tell that I'm an optimist. I am an optimist, a cautious optimist. I am not believing that we will have, well, in certain areas, I am not believing that in my state that we will have the kind of aggressive engagement that many people are predicting, but it's better to be prepared than it is to have to put up with that. The other thing about North Carolina is you can carry your gun anywhere except in a school or a public, a federal state building. So many of our polling places are in churches and private buildings. And so that people then are allowed to take their guns. And I think we're preparing for worst case scenario when in fact I'm hopeful that the election will go off smoothly. I know in some parts of the country that's not going to be the case. Professor Dion, what?
No, well, I was just nodding. I thought it was an excellent question. And I No, I was just nodding because I thought it was an excellent question. And my worry about this election is not so much a repeat of January 6th, although, people can gather in this room and say, boy, was that guy from America really wrong on January 7th. But I'm much more worried about disruptions at polling places, efforts. And some of them can be quite peaceable. It's if somebody's sitting there and challenging every single voter's right to vote in precincts where you think you're going to lose, that lengthens the lines. Some people drop off the lines, and it disenfranchises people. And the Republican National Committee has put less money in voter turnout and more in what they call election integrity. And I don't know what that means on election day. And I'm hoping I'm wrong about this. And I hope your optimism is correct. But
cautiously optimistic.
Or hopefulness. Hope is different than optimism.
Yeah.
But I think it's something I'm worried about. Could I ask a question while I got the mic? Oh,
I was just going to add that I happened to have a conversation about 2 weeks ago with the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And she said that it is now a felony in a state of Alabama to assist somebody to the polling place, including a person in a wheelchair, whatever. It's also illegal and a felony to give people water or food in the state of Alabama, which of course they're going to try to challenge in court. But that's the kind of issue you're up against.
And additionally, not to pick on North Carolina, but with absentee ballots this year, it requires 2 additional signatures. You need 2 witnesses.
this is in North Carolina.
In North Carolina, you need two witness signatures on your absentee ballot and a copy of your driver's license in order for it to count. So there are a lot of changes that have occurred. Also, there's a change in the number of observers, Democratic and Republican observers. And as Professor Dion said, they can challenge anybody's vote. So if I am standing there, anybody can say, I don't have the right to vote. And then I would end up with a provisional ballot, and I would have to prove that I did. And so all of those changes are ways of stifling participation and access. And the last time that I was a poll worker, we condensed 2 districts, but didn't increase the number of people who were working the polls, and people stood in line for 2 hours, which is almost unheard of. And then they left. They had to go home and pick up their kids, or they had to go back to work. And so we were losing voters simply because of the process. And that's not a good thing. I liked, when I lived in Colorado, it was all mail in. So we got it in the mail, and it was not a big deal. And in Oregon, people are automatically registered when they turn 18. I mean, so there are some states that are doing some things that are progressive to make sure that people have access and that people can, in fact, exercise their right to vote. But then there are the states that are engaged in voter suppression activities. And I also tell the story, I have lived in my house for 10 years, and I've been in 6 districts.
And you've been
in 6 districts in 10 years. Yeah. And part of the reason is that I live south of UNC Chapel Hill. And so we're considered this enclave of liberalism. And so we are always redistricted to where we do the least amount of harm. And so where I vote this year, the district that I vote in this year will not be the district that I vote in next year, because it's still in litigation in the courts. But we had to vote with something. We had to use, so we're using the current map that we have. But next year I'll be in a different district.
Dion and Mrs. Dion has a question.
Well, you go first. I've had my say. I can ask after. I just want to thank you. Mm-hmm. I had no idea that Charles Curtis's background, and if you saw me using my phone, it wasn't because I wasn't listening to you. I want to know about Charles Curtis. Yeah. So thank you for that.
You are welcome.
Well, thank you. So, is this working? Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. That goes for all 3 of you, of course. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, and this is also a question I suppose that would involve all 3 of you maybe. I mean, since 1992, the Republicans have won the popular vote once, in 2004. All the other elections went to the Democrats. So I mean, and yet, of course, Bush won in 2000 via the Electoral College. and Trump won in 2016 via the Electoral College. So my question is, in what sense are we dealing with we the people when we're dealing with American democracy?
That is an excellent question, and I didn't speak a lot about the Electoral College or the campaign afoot to have a national popular vote implemented. Actually, I was looking back in 2000, I wrote an article for the National Civic Review on abolishing the Electoral College. It's called Who Should Elect the President? And we advocated at the League, I advocate personally for a direct vote, a national popular vote. And so there are 13 states that are now in this coalition. That would require a constitutional amendment, and it would require 38 states to ratify. But is it time for that to happen? Yes. Is the conversation escalating? Yes. Will it be in my lifetime? Probably not.
Turn on.
I have a question if we have time, and for maybe for both of you. I'm just curious to what extent the demographic shift in the South is responsible for this kind of conservative trend. Again, I'm a Minnesotan, ignorant, nice guy. But my impression was that the South was on a road towards progress, right? That
Yes.
Racial integration, all these things, this is a long march towards a more just society. And I'm curious if there was a point at which that, people moving from the North to the South, and if the demographics has been part of this story of the shift in, voter registration, voter suppression, and so forth.
I would say it is a part of it, and that's why we're right now a battleground state, and every day there's somebody there campaigning. But it's not just people moving from the North to the South. We have, in my county alone, 3 international companies coming into that county. That changes because the demographics of the people that are coming to work in those companies, it changes by age, by ethnicity. At our small little airport we have direct flights to Frankfurt. We have direct flights to Paris. We have, and it's as a result of those companies coming in and changing the demographics. So yes, there are a lot of people migrating from the North to North Carolina, but there are also a lot of international companies coming there. And as a result of that, we have become a battleground state. We are, so we are no longer strictly a red state, but one of the points that you make is people are still trying to hold on to the past. And I am not saying something that I haven't said to everybody. I said, spoiler alert, the Civil War is over and you lost. We are still fighting the Civil War in North Carolina. And it is one of the more progressive Southern states. And so the demographic changes that are occurring rapidly. And people are resisting. And through that resistance, that's where the frustration comes. That's why there's a fear that something, may happen. But I would say by the time we get to the next election, we're not going to be a battleground state anymore. We will have shifted all the way to blue. And that's why I'll keep getting redistricted.
All right. Thank you so much. Any last question from the room?
Well, thank you all for your attention and your time, and great.
So thank you everyone for coming out to our first day of our pre-election event. Hopefully we'll see all of you again tomorrow. That includes the people on Zoom. Thank you to the embassy for generously sponsoring these events that we're hosting. And thank you to Professor Dion Woolner and Jefferson-Jenkins for giving wonderful talks today. Thank you.
That was great.
Oh.
The question I was going to ask is about constitutional amendments, that we have gone through periods where we were constitutionally adventurous, the Civil War.
It's still on.
Amendments like the Second